Minister is right here.
Minister, all right. ¿Cómo está, ministro? Muy buenos días.
Buen
Muy
día,
buenas
Julio.
tardes por acá.
Sí, muchas gracias por este espacio. Tenía una
Good,
actividad
good
previa,
morning for
pero aquí
this
en
this
plena
space,
estación
and
de metro, que
thank you for this space and
fue
the
muy gentil
opportunity.
de darme este espacio para así poder asistir a la
I'm at a
entrevista.
subway
Siempre
station,
dispuesto a
and they
toda
were kind
la
enough
actividad
to offer
física.
me
Así que muy
this
contento de
office
acompañarlo hoy
for
en esta entrevista.
the conversation without
Como siempre lo
interfering with their
pillamos en
activities. So
terreno,
I'm really
terreno, terreno.
grateful
Muy bien.
to be able to
Ah, yo soy,
participate. As always,
Ok.
we
Bueno,
we
damos
talk to you, and
comienzo a
you're always
este
working.
webinar.
But
Soy Julio
very well,
Briones,
let's get
asesor
started with
técnico de
our
la
webinar.
GIZ,
My name's
basado
Julio
en
Briones. I'm
Chile
the
y
GIZ
representado acá en las
technical
oficinas de la
advisor
GIZ
in
en
Chile,
Santiago.
and also
Em,
speaking from the GIZ
Quería
office in
partir
Santiago,
con
Chile.
una breve
I'd
introducción,
like to
¿no?
start
De
off
que hace un par de semanas se ha
with a brief
desarrollado
introduction.
la COP30 en Belén, Brasil.
That
De
a few
acuerdo a
weeks
varios
ago we had
medios de
COP30 in Belém
prensa,
in Brazil,
los resultados han sido calificados como
and according to several
insuficientes,
communication
pobres, ¿no? Al respecto,
vehicles, and
el mejor, por
the
ejemplo, el The
conversations
Economist
were considered
dice que
insufficient and precarious.
si bien la
The
conferencia
Economist
reconoce que
said
se
that
requiere más acción
although the
climática,
conference recognizes
falla en
that
decir
there is
cuál
a
es esa
need
acción climática y
for
mostrar
more
alternativas más
climate action,
concretas para eso.
it
Dice
fails
que no
to
hace referencia a la
specify
salida de los
which
combustibles
actions they
fósiles,
are, and
menos
without
presenta una
any
hoja de ruta para ello.
roadmap or
También la
no
BBC
offer
habla
of
que
any
fue
solutions
una
for fossil fuels, and
accidentada
doesn't
cumbre
even
sin
introduce any
mención a los
action plan.
combustibles
BBC
fósiles,
says
una de
that
las
it
más
was
divisorias que ha
a
habido,
summit
que
that
Colombia
didn't mention
protestó
fossil fuels at
respecto,
all,
que
and
dice esto
Colombia
fue un baño de realidad sobre
protested
hasta qué
against
punto se
this,
ha
saying
derrumbado el
that it
consenso
was
global
a
sobre
reality
qué hacer
check,
sobre el
that
cambio climático.
understanding to
Deutsche
what
Welle
point
cita
is
a
there
altos
a
personeros
global
de la Unión
consensus
Europea,
on what to do in terms of climate
como la
change.
ministra española de Transición Ecológica, que dice no es suficiente, tenemos que trabajar, tenemos tiempo para mejorarlo, y también cita al
Economic Transition
comisario
Minister
europeo del
uh,
clima,
mentioned
diciendo,
that we need to
comillas, lo
work
que está
more on
sobre la
this, and
mesa ahora
in addition,
inaceptable, dado que estamos muy lejos de donde debiéramos
the
estar.
Climate
Esto no puede
Negotiation
acabar sin
Committee
acuerdo,
mentioned
siento
that the
decir. ¿Ya?
conditions are
Sin
unacceptable,
embargo,
and we need a deal, an
lo que
agreement, better
no
yet.
muestran
However,
estos artículos de
what it does
prensa o
not
no
show,
profundizan
what these don't
mayormente, yo creo que
articles
son dos
don't
cosas.
show,
Uno, el complejo y difícil
they don't dive deeper
proceso
into
de las
two aspects.
negociaciones de
First
las
of all, is the
COP,
complexity
de
and the
cada una de las
challenges
COP. ¿Ya?
of
Y la
negotiation
segunda, las buenas noticias que
at
también
each
se
event.
producen con las COP.
And secondly,
En el primer caso,
is that we actually have good news. That in the first case, we
de la
have
complejidad de llegar a acuerdo, claro, no mencionan los esfuerzos
the
que se
issue of
realizaron,
complexity to
las
reaching an
tensiones que
agreement.
se
Of course, we don't
generaron,
mention
los
all the
valores que
efforts,
estaban en pugna,
the
si
tension
acaso
that's
llegar
generated, and
a una
the values that we have to
impulsar
face.
la salida de los combustibles fósiles y proponer medidas
If
más
there
ambiciosas
were
a
a
costa
solution
de que no fuera con
to
consenso o
phase
incluso con
out
ruptura.
fossil
Y por
fuels
otro
more
lado
ambitiously,
está
even
la
though
visión
there's
de
a
saquemos
break
los
or
combustibles
rupture,
fósiles,
and on the other
pongamos
hand, we
medidas
have
menos
a vision
ambiciosas y
of
lleguemos a un
let's
consenso. Pero ¿a qué precio?
adopt
¿Ya?
less
Por el lado de
ambitious
las buenas
measures
noticias,
reaching a consensus.
tenemos
But what are the
dos buenas
costs of
noticias.
this?
La
On
primera
the other hand, we
es
do
sobre
have
la
two
declaración
uh,
que impulsó Chile,
issues that are good
específicamente el
news. The
ministro
first is the
Muñoz,
declaration
sobre
brought by
descarbonización
Chile,
del
especially
transporte
from our
y que
Minister
fue
Muñoz, on
apoyada por
transport
varios países
decarbonization, which was
europeos y
supported
también por varios
by
de nuestros
several European
países
countries
hermanos latinoamericanos. ¿Ya?
and
También hay buenas
several
noticias
of
con
our
respecto al aumento
Latin
de la ambición en
partners,
las
Latin
energías.
American partners,
Entonces, la pregunta es,
the
bueno,
increase
¿cómo
of
podemos conocer
ambitions
más
by
sobre la
NDCs.
complejidad, la dificultad de este debate,
So
estas negociaciones
the
en la
question is
COP30?
how to know more
¿Cómo
about the
podemos
challenges,
conocer
about the
más
debate, the negotiations
sobre esta
during COP30,
declaración,
and how
sobre
to
el
find out
proceso que
more
van a
about
alcanzar esos apoyos
this
y también
declaration
sobre cómo van
regarding the process
evolucionando
to reach
el transporte
this
de las NDCs?
consensus
Para
and this
esto,
support? and how we will move forward with the negotiations regarding transportation and NDCs. That's why we're hosting this webinar for the transportation community, sustainable transportation community, financed by the European Union and the international cooperation and changing transport from the Mobilize Net Zero project with the support of my colleagues at GIZ and New Bongardt, who is here with us today. So with that and the issues and the questions that I brought today, we have the agenda for our session today. We have three main blocks. And because of our minister's agenda, one of these blocks is separate, but in green we are going to talk about the results of the discussions during COP30. My colleague, Daniel Bongardt, will talk about the transportation sector, the implications for the transportation sector, better yet, and then Maruxa Cardama regarding the transportation sector conversations during COP30, and they participated during these processes during COP, and they will be able to tell us firsthand regarding the complexities and challenges and tension and opportunities as well that these discussions offer to the transportation sector. Then the second block in blue, my colleague Cristóbal Pineda, Minister of the Telecommunications and Transportation Minister of Chile, will talk about the declaration, how this process came to be. And after that, we will move to the main activity of our webinar, which is an interview with the minister. And my colleague Natalia will conduct talking about before, during, and after the declaration, what the challenges we have ahead of us, in addition to COP30's vision regarding the transportation sector. Lastly, we will have Nikola and Belén Vasquez from SLOCAT, who will present an analysis, a recent analysis, on the third generation of NDCs and on how these ambitions have increased the number of countries that include climate and transportation goals. So moving with our agenda, let's get started. And I'll start out with my colleague, Daniel Bongardt, coordinator of the cluster for mobility and infrastructure at GIZ. Daniel, you have the floor.
Yeah, thank you very much, Julio, and welcome everybody, dear Minister. It's really great to see you, and congratulations also to the success of the declaration at the COP. Yeah, so I think it's really great to see so many colleagues joining here and having you here. I think it's really quite important to understand for us, for the transport community, also to what was going on in Belém. And I also want to extend my congratulations to Maruxa and the SLOCAT team to running the program of the first ever transport pavilion for 2 weeks, and I think the community has been extremely well visible. And so that was something what really was remarkable 10 years after the Paris Agreement was decided. So this year in 2025, it's 10 years ago. Since then, we are talking about to get to net zero emission by mid-century and to keep to a 1.5 degree target, which means 1.5 degrees above pre-industrial levels. And I think many things happen, but at the same time, of course, we also see with concerns the analytics that it will be very likely that we will not that we will overshoot the 1.5 degrees. And So the transport sector is extremely important for this. With a quarter of the global emissions, it's really relevant that things are happening here. And there were big hopes on Brazil as a host of the COP, the Latin American COP. I think that was really a very special occasion. And I think they did a great job in also setting on the agenda so different topics, not only the Amazonas, which of course was quite important to Brazil, but also on the phase out of fossil fuels, which was put on the discussion from the very first day. And I think the president himself influenced also the discussions throughout the 2 weeks. Of course, I think maybe I would like to start just briefly before the COP, because this year all the countries were called to submit their climate plans, the so-called NDCs, nationally determined contributions. And you, Minister, also called at the ITF meeting to countries to submit ambitious ones. And so we saw many of them coming relatively late. So there was a bit of concern, I think, before the COP. So how do we see this? Now, having more than 100 NDCs being handed in, I think the number expected is about 160, so some more will be still to come. But so this was really extraordinary because it only happens every 5 years. And we see that the NDCs are improving. They are more detailed, more explicit on transport, and we will hear later about that from Nikola and Belén. But at the same time, they are still not at the ambition level that is needed to really achieve the 1.5 degrees as in other sectors as well in transport. So I think the journey is continuing, and we need to continue also to engage in the discussions. And I understand that so the next step within the negotiation process is a global stocktake in 2028, when again, so the countries who are discussing about the ambition that was submitted. So this mechanism, submit a plan bottom up, then discuss again in the global stocktake, where do we land? So this is an extremely powerful process, because I think it continues now for so long and the countries are still engaged in it, but at the same time it's also slow. And this is one of the weaknesses of the Paris system, that we have this slowness. So I think so in order to really get to implementation, so there is more needed. And this was one of the hopes from this year's COP, I think, that was this discussion about roadmaps. So I think we saw a shift from the discussion of targets to a discussion about implementation. And discussing roadmap means how do we implement it? How do we achieve the targets? And so this discussion, I think, is extremely important. And there was a powerful signal, even if we didn't see those roadmaps, especially the transition away from fossil fuels, so-called tough roadmap, so to be mentioned in the final document. There were a few countries, mainly oil-producing countries, that were blocking this. And as transport sector is a main consumer of oil, of course, this is very relevant. The transport sector is very relevant, and I think so. If the transport sector is sending signals that it's possible to transition away from fossil fuels, it's also easier for the COP and the climate world to agree on targets and joint initiatives and on roadmaps on TUSO. So I think it's really important to have that implementation focus, and that might be a shift. So when we look in 10 years back to COP 2025, my hope is that this shift from target to implementation got visible. I think there were a couple of other things negotiated that are very relevant to mention. So the Brazil presidency took up voluntarily, without being able to really embed it on the agenda, the Belén mission to 1.5 degrees, to increase this discussion about to continue this discussion about ambition, and also the Global Implementation Accelerator to continue this discussion about implementation. And we have to see during this year whether the Brazilian presidency, together with the upcoming presidency of the shared presidency of Turkey and Australia, they will be able to keep that momentum and then get this really finally in the negotiation track in next year. So that is one element. I think that's promising, but we still have to see. And I think there are big opportunities for the transport sector to engage here and also show. And the global transport effort proposed by Juan Carlos Muñoz and the Chilean government, I think, is a key element here that can connect to these elements of the final agreement. So just to briefly mention also the just transition mechanism that was established. It's still unclear how it will look like in the end, but there will be a stronger focus on just transition. And again, transport, I think, connects very well to this transition mechanism because I think transport enables people to be part of the society, to be part of the economy. And so it's about jobs, it's about the social impacts, about the transition of our industry. So that's very relevant for transport as well. Adaptation finance was announced to be higher, and it's also a very relevant topic for us to see so that the infrastructure must be resilient and must be adapted to the climate change, whether it's railway systems to coping with heat, flooding, different elements that we already see today. So I think what we really need is now to get into that implementation mode. And so there were very promising signs I saw. And so I think initiatives like the zero emission vehicle breakthrough or the zero emission vehicle memorandum on heavy duty vehicles, they were continuing. Even more countries joined in. Mexico, I think, joined the ZEV memorandum on heavy duty trucks. And then, of course, the biggest highlight, I think, was a global transport effort with that we talk later about this one, because it really sets an interim target that also very much connects to the UN Decade on Sustainable Transport. So I think this vibrant community also was represented in the report of the Global Climate Action Agenda. The report was adopted by the COP plenary, and all the initiatives that you are working and commissioned to also were mentioned there. All these plans to accelerate solutions, so mentions like electric buses, Sao Paulo, de-risking platforms, aviation, different areas here. So I think we need to keep and continue this bottom-up approach to continue. So I will finish here, and I think we will see a very interesting and rich discussion. So just to briefly summarize my three things is, so first, the Paris system works, but it's slow. So we need to get to implementation. And I think the first mover alliances that drive ambition and implementation, they are crucial. So the COP process is reliant on the transport sector to do something. Thank you.
Thanks, Daniel, for your presentation regarding COP30 and its main results. Now, I'll give the floor to my colleague, Cristóbal Pineda, Chief of the Public Transport Division of the Ministry for Transport and Communications in Chile, and a fundamental player in this process in order to enable this agreement with these other 11 countries. So, Cristóbal, the floor is yours. He's going to tell us about the declaration, its reach, its goals, how it was formed, and how was its process. Cristóbal, please go ahead. Thanks, Julio. Thanks very much. A fine morning and a fine afternoon for all of you. In the session, I'm going to start sharing my screen. So I'll tell you briefly about the content of this declaration. As Julio said already, we were working hardly on it in recent months with different countries, and I'll tell you soon which countries are signing this declaration. But it was, as I said, hard work in the last 6 months that we used to work on that declaration. As you may well know, the emissions in the transport sector continue to rise despite our efforts. Therefore, the efforts that are needed for the future need to be stronger. That is the essential part of this declaration. Transport today represents around 25% of emissions of GHG worldwide, with different variations in different countries. However, it's a highly polluting sector. Therefore, we, as members of the sector, need to be in charge of these conditions. I believe that the best motivation to actually sign the declaration is the insistence of having a quantifiable effort within the context of the COP. However, in previous declarations and stocktake, the transport sector is mentioned quite strongly as one of the sectors to achieve decarbonization, and herein we have an agreement. I do not know if you identify certain efforts that are quantifiable that allow us to measure. Finally, how are our efforts doing in this sector? I believe this is the main motivation we had before this declaration, which is obviously the contents it has, so that we can continue to quantify what we want to communicate after. Part of the essential content of the declaration is on the screen. First, we recognize, as I said before, that even though that is part of the global stocktake, and therefore the transport sector is always present in discussions regarding the COP, we need additional efforts. And that additional efforts in the transport sector should focus on avoiding unnecessary travel and improving. This is part of the declaration to avoid certain travels that are not necessary, that may raise questions regarding that. Some countries asked if avoiding travels was an essential part of the declaration, and we always say that our focus is trying to change and improve. Therefore, it was stated quite explicitly in the first paragraphs of this declaration. Secondly, and I think that's part of the core of the declaration, is to call upon all the parties of the Paris Agreement to work together. That has two components, and here is the quantifiable part. Firstly, reaching global terms and having a drop of 1/4 in total energy, or the demand of total energy in the transport sector in 2025. And the second metric, which is quantifiable, has to do with the fact that 1/3 of fuel comes from biofuels or renewable sources. Those are the two quantifiable efforts that are the most important that we propose in that declaration. Those two pieces of metrics also agree with what the International Energy Agency has said in its report from 2022. We also got to know that during the COP, the agency launched an update of that report, and it changed a few things in it. Therefore, we are in charge of the metrics we had before 2022. In 2025, they were modified in a certain sense, and the metrics will be a bit different in the future for that new update. But as for now, the update is based on the report from 2022.
Very well. A third point, also important, is that this commitment needs to be a commitment, a collective commitment that increases resilience and at the same time reduces emissions. When we're talking about decarbonization, we're also talking about resilience, and that needs to be made extremely clear. Not just reducing emissions, but also working on the resilience, and it's an important and applicable concept to transportation. As a fourth point, we need to recognize that the pace of these transition is diverse. It depends on the context of each country. So our intention in the declaration is not to specifically identify each measures, but actually that each country is in charge of choosing the best paths according to their social, environmental, and economic conditions in each country. And that needs to be reflected nationally. So we also want to make it clear that the pathway for each party is dependent on each decision by each of the countries that participating. We didn't want to impose anything specific because we wanted to leave a level of flexibility to each of the countries involved. Lastly, we talked about financing, and when we're talking about decarbonization, of course, financing is an important aspect. And so it has to do with the more vulnerable and developing countries. This is a relevant component. So we also wanted to talk about financing and mitigation and adaptation for the transportation sector. We made that clear in the declaration. So why then are these global efforts, will they allow us to reach a scenario of net zero scenario by 2050? We have a graph here how the progress has been carried out in the transportation sector, and to reach net zero by 2050. We have an intermediate goal by 2035, which we are driving in the declaration, and it's okay if we reach this by that year. We can revisit the path that would make the scenario possible. So we are proposing this intermediate goal by 2035 that would allow us to transition for carbon neutrality by 2050. So of course we have here the data came from the report in 2022. And what do these efforts mean in practice? And as I was saying earlier, our focus is to change to improve. So not just reduction in demand, but also a change in behavior, personal behavior. And that's what we're seeking in the end, at the end of the day. That makes the use of and transition, phasing out from fossil fuels is easier. And then the second point, as I mentioned earlier, each country has to make its own efforts, but the summation of all these efforts should reach our ultimate goal, but it depends on the particular challenges of each and context of each country, whether it's socioeconomic or so each country needs to decide which is possible to adopt. And lastly, our main goal was to jointly acknowledge that it's necessary for a global target. Transport sector needs to, whether to have good intentions and good goals, but that it's something quantifiable that we could measure how to move as we're moving forward and as we are heading towards 2050. So we reached to the participation of 11 countries initially from Latin America and Europe, but we continue our efforts to bring more countries. Our efforts don't end here. We want to keep promoting this declaration and and working in that sense, but we want to work on implementing that our colleagues in GIZ are collaborating in that sense. We're going to continue on the same lines throughout the next months, and we hope to be able to continue counting on the cooperation from the participating parties and additional countries that allow us to reach the global goals of 2035 and reaching a good scenario by 2050 in terms of decarbonization of the transportation sector. So I refer back to you, Julio. Thank you so much for your presentation that allows us to move forward to the next part of this webinar, which is the interview with the Minister Juan Carlos Muñoz. the Chilean Minister of Transportation. Firstly, Natalia and myself will bombard you with several questions, all right? So I'll just start it off. Could you please comment how the process of building this declaration happened until it was launched at COP30? So could you talk a little bit about the minutiae of the declaration? Tell us a little bit about how it came to be, and thank you so much, Julio. And thank you for the opportunity. I'd like to also thank everyone that's listening and all my friends and participating in this session today. It was an important challenge that conspired with many desires and institutions that and the challenges that were presented. And keeping that in mind is that in May of 2024-25, Chile had the responsibility to preside the international organization that gathers and the transportation ministries. And like we like to say, we wanted to take the most of this opportunity, not just but the honor of presiding and giving the visibility to our country, but also the possibility of thinking of what we could do with this space and within what we worked with this international agenda. We considered three recommendations: transportation, security, decarbonization, so that we could take suggestions and recommendations with consensus and multilateralism. So we received approval, but not decarbonization. These declarations demand unanimity. And we know that decarbonization, we know that scientists say that this is a relevant challenge that needs to be carried out. Not all countries follow the same thought process. So since we weren't able to move the recommendation forward, the first thing was that the presidency run by Chile launched a new declaration. So let's leave it as a declaration, a single declaration, and after that a call to action for many other countries to promote decarbonization of the transportation sector at a global level. It's also important to mention that it's a year where the countries needed to reaffirm their NDCs and in terms of decarbonization of the transportation sector as well. The transportation sector is often left out of NDCs or kind of hidden in the NDC, so it was important to promote that. We started working with 40 countries, more approximately. We had comments, suggestions, and questions, and we started setting up the different versions of this document. And the idea was that the most amount of countries could participate. We didn't want just for the declaration to lose its weight. We wanted to maintain its ambitions, but also considering different requests from each of the countries. So we integrated most of the recommendations, and we concluded with these 11 countries. And then at COP, we had a cooperation from one of them, and then so we have a different level of climate ambitions, where policies and NDCs and national strategies are in line with the goals of this declaration. It's also possible to mention that in the end, some of the countries that they left comments that are not questioned here in the central section of this. They're ready to move forward to decarbonize the transportation sector. We didn't lose the expectation that some of these countries that followed us throughout this process, they might still get excited with the project, and we believe that we can reach something quite impactful in this declaration. Thank you, Minister. Hello, everyone. Natalie, thank you, Minister, for participating in this interview. And continuing with the next question, as Cristóbal mentioned, one of the main axes of this declaration, this global effort for decarbonizing transportation sector, as you mentioned, it wasn't refused by any of the countries, but what are the main advantages and contributions of this global effort to the transportation sector? I believe that the declaration Cristóbal presented shows that there is deliberation. It's not the fastest possible, and I admit that there might be innovative elements in terms of energy efforts, and in my opinion, that allow to widen the scope of how to contribute to less emissions. But then concrete measures like electrification, use of renewable sources of energy, and it is all included in this scope. So I like what Cristóbal mentioned, that the global shift improve is not just to improve the power grid. There are efforts that go beyond that. For example, reducing distances to workplaces, lower energy consumption, better mobility. All that reduces to less energy consumption to improve the planet as a whole. And then if we can get cities to make better use of public transportation, that if we shorten the distances, commuting distances, then of course other urban mobility aspects will be improved. If then we can improve the cities as a whole. In addition to the declaration, there's a dual ambition. On the one hand, proposing that by 2035 we can increase the use of renewable energy by 1/3, like promoting electrification and of sustainable fuels, and how this energy source would come from. Would it come from fossil fuels? Then in this case, it would be pointless. So it goes against the goals that we want to achieve. So like Chile as an example for renewable and conventional like solar and hydro power plant is part of what we truly want to allow us to move towards decarbonization, and as a proposal to reduce the use of energy, and then to promote more sustainable transportation like bicycles, public transportation, walking, reducing commuting distances and times, and in addition, electric mobility brings more efficiency to combustion engines, internal combustion engines, less inefficiencies in heat exchange and road traction. An important aspect of this declaration, it mentioned a global effort for transportation in conjunction with not just country by country, but as a whole, seeking to reach this goal by 2050. It's not just an individual goal, it's a collective and global goal, where each country has a political, economic, and social aspects and different capabilities to contribute. So it's up to, we can't request the same thing from each of the countries, so they need to start from their own realities with the commitment to contribute to the common goal. And lastly, one of the benefits is, although the final horizon is this goal for 2050, it all translates into an intermediate goal by 2035, and on the timeline that goal shows immediate action, and it sets a deadline for the next 10 years. So it's a clear sign where the commitments that we have need to translate into concrete measures for the next decade, also making authorities to work and act right now. And then I think many countries have actions, very commendable actions, and it's important to make them as visible as possible and inspire more people.
Thanks, Minister. Julio, the word is yours. Well, Minister, you told us about the entire declaration and what are the main points, but please tell us a bit more. How is that going on? How is the declaration going to be implemented? Thanks, Julio. The implementation is what comes after. We are developing it But we have three main pillars. First, we have a technical component. We need to be able to measure. We need to be able to have a systematic follow-up to see the advance of that global effort year after year. We are developing a methodology that I would like to highlight. The NGOs that are helping us, GIZ, the International Energy Agency, and others that are following us, which were important when trying to structure the methodologies. So this systematic follow-up requires the methodology that on the one hand is going to check the energy consumption globally, together with the participation of renewable energy. So we have this indicator using that then, and which are going to come from the IEA. That's going to help us monitor the progress and also see the input of the signatory countries, and also we'll see what other measures we can use or foster. The second pillar has to do with expanding the network. We have 11 countries that's doing well. However, I believe this is just the beginning. I am optimistic. It's the beginning of the process. We want to have more countries and move forward with an international coalition that is committed with the decarbonization of transport, in which each country can offer as input the best capacities it has according to its context. And the third pillar is to establish some sort of a solid governance for that effort. I believe it's important to have a governance structure that is our ally, that has an integrated directory from all the countries, with their ministries, with their responsible advisors, to see what is going to be the strategic standpoint. And maybe that has to do with the entire management and the technical follow-up with reports and the sensibilization of the initiatives in order to ensure that the process advances, and also having the support of the NGOs is going to be very important. And lastly, we need to have an advisor group that can actually work with data, information, etc., that are relevant for the secretariat and the directorate, that allow us to compare the results that we are receiving, that they are sustainable and feasible. This is developing. We are trying to accelerate the launch of the declaration, and what comes after is also working as soon as possible on these efforts. Thanks a lot, Minister. Natalia, please. Mr. Minister, and also considering the declaration and going beyond, we know that in 2023, the United Nations General Assembly declared the first decade for sustainable transport that's going to start in 2026 and will last until 2035. So, Minister, how do you believe this declaration contributes to the follow-up and implementation of this decade? Well, it seems to be evident. We have the same horizon in time. It's actually quite timely, and it's notable the coincidence in time. There is a synchrony, which is notable. The decade of sustainable transport actually covers the period we are proposing in order to reach the goals. The goal of a reduction of 1/4 and the goal of increasing in 1/3 the use of renewable energy so that is sustainable. It's exactly in the same period of time. And in that sense, I believe that here we have good coordination, which is quite fortuitous, so that we can contribute directly to the goals of this decade by integrating the decarbonization on the one hand, and also science on the other one, to promote the electrification, to promote something more sustainable for this structure, for the environment, and solutions that work with the security, sustainability, safety of transport. All of that is relevant, and it's part of this decade. but that's fully aligned with what we are proposing. In that sense, I also like the fact that both the declaration and the decade emphasize a progressive transition. We are not thinking about 2050, but an intermediate goal, and that also differentiates something for each country so that they can bet on according to their circumstances. And considering the climate vulnerability, the development, and equality when accessing transport, it's also important that that is in our minds. And I believe that declaration is actually quite nurturing. They are key issues for the decade: investigation, national collaboration. We need to mitigate and adapt. And I believe that this may serve as an early pillar in the decade by forcing immediate and coordinated actions. So this starts next year. So countries may visibilize and share how they started attaining the goals, how they are coming closer to that ambition. In the case of our country, we have lots of efforts here being in place, implemented in transport, not only using the subway and train lines, but now with electric buses and the impulse we have in Chile that actually stated this goal in the previous government to decarbonize as much as possible. We need to continue to electrify the public transport. And I believe that's been key, not only to reach the goals, but also to transport an entire sector. Nowadays in Chile, we have lots of operators that are using electric buses. There are different brands that are using it. We have an energy system that fits it, which is being developed in the industry. We have a financial sector that relies on that because the public sector, the transport sector, developed something that is actually hard. They do not usually receive financing. They are not reliable people for the banking sector. Here we were able to use both so that public transport is actually elegant. It has like a good rate and always being part of big decisions and receive good financing sources. And this is the industry we have in Chile that allows us to demonstrate the cost of ownership for electric buses so that it can be competitive with the compared to diesel buses because the maintenance costs are lower, the operational costs are lower, and the costs of the fleet are much lower when we compare that to 5 years ago. So it's actually quite competitive, and it's the operators now that start saying that we need to change to electric buses. And this is part of the experience that we would like to offer you because surely some other countries may take similar steps. I see that cities as London and Paris, for example, are using bicycles. So in that sense, this is being a bit more aggressive by the modification of the streets and less parking spaces. We need to do that. We cannot just concentrate on alternatives. We need to address the elephant in the room, which is got an excessive side and the use of vehicles, especially in big cities, which is similar to cholesterol levels in the human body. So here we have a huge opportunity to be able to work. And I also would like to learn about the efforts in other countries with the street electrification. New York is doing something that's quite inspiring. And in several cities in the country are showing results of a similar size. And it's more difficult for local authorities in different countries in the world. Well, that's actually basically what I could say. Thanks a lot, Minister, for your answer. I understand that we have your presence until 1 p.m. Brazil and Argentina time. Let's open some space for a couple of questions for the minister. For those of you who wish to ask him something, please raise your hands, your virtual hand, and feel free. I see questions in the chat window. Yeah, sure. Natalia, can you please help me? Yeah, sure. We have a question by Maria Santos, and she says, thanks a lot, Minister, for your presentation and for being the leader of the decarbonization policies in the transport sector. Are the aviation and maritime modes included in that declaration? What are the legal consequences for countries when they become signatories of that declaration if they do not fulfill its requirements? Well, the first question is yes, the second is I don't know. The first question is yes, effectively, all global transport is included because we have the commitment to decarbonize and there are no exceptions. We have something much more complex. The maritime and aviation transports are more complex to decarbonize, and we have efforts, for example, in the maritime sector that have to do, for example, with the incorporation of the use of derivatives. In the case of Chile, we want to develop that type of industry, and I believe here we have a huge opportunity in order to reduce the emissions of the maritime sector progressively by using these energy sources. In aviation, that's also very difficult. And in a country such as in Chile, that we have long distances to travel from a city to city, it's very hard for us to reduce the emissions of the aviation sector when the kilometers in travels, especially international travels, are that long. And that also has to do or goes hand in hand with the renewable sources, renewable fuels. And at the moment, the main alternative we have is that we also need to incorporate public policies because it's not just establishing goals that are feasible. And what can be feasible for tomorrow may not be feasible in the future. But all of those members of the declaration need to advance, need to move forward toward that direction. And that's very relevant for the industry because then you start saying, okay, this is what the countries are doing. It's very important. And we can start seeing how we can decarbonize the entire transport system. The electric buses in Chile and Santiago has the largest electric bus fleet in the world. There's no other city like that in the world. And everything has been done by using Chinese buses. It's not because we like them especially. We are quite neutral regarding the origin of the technology. But China seems to have started before, and in that sense, it's not just the declaration of the things we would like to happen. They need to be important directives for the industry. And the company and countries that start using that, I apologize, we lost signal. So in that sense, that has that value. So in some of the scopes, in the maritime sector, the aviation sector, that's a bit more difficult. And I think that declaration actually helps us work with that up. Thanks, Minister. And just to add something up, what are the legal consequences for the countries? Because this is a declaration in which countries actually committed themselves voluntarily. So it's not such a document that creates legal consequences for them. So they were voluntarily committed to doing or applying those efforts in order to reach that global effort. Let's see another question. One more question, and then we can let the minister go. Okay, fine. We have several questions. I am going to try and choose the ones that are concerned to the topic. Thanks, Minister, for the initiative and the presentation. What would be the path or process for other countries to be able to become signatories? It's just the conviction that there is something they can do. The conviction that we have commitments that are important, feasible, and that are there just in front of us. We cannot just not see them. And we continue to hear political voices that actually question the climate change in the sense that this is actually happening.
There's a sense of urgency and desperation regarding a process that needs to be seen from any perspective, like reducing methane carbon dioxide and as climate changes that are more and more visible, such as we had rains in Chile that were somewhat stronger than normal with higher temperatures and lower temperatures, better yet. We had much more floods and mountain ranges that affected the
aun cuando sean algo que está todavía en desarrollo, se empiezan a ver algunas de las consecuencias en forma preliminar.
Consequences that we're seeing consequences preliminarily. So one of our countries where we're seeing climate change makes changes more sensitive, and where countries can support other countries to make a climate action in a context that allows us to achieve the support. But it's interesting that it requires policies and investments, and none of these solutions bring unhappiness. On the other, quite the opposite. The more people use bicycles, the better, to reduce noise, pollution, transforming so that at the same time we have a combination and more modernity. It's a huge opportunity.
¿Alguien tiene el micrófono encendido? Por favor, que lo apague.
Does anybody have their microphone open? Could they please mute their microphone? Thank you. Thank you, Minister, for your words. It was a seed that was planted not just by 11 countries, but the 200 out of 200 existing countries. But I believe that it is the seed that's been giving room to a huge tree where so many countries will want to participate. So I believe in an international context that we have countries with greater ambitions, some countries with less great ambitions, where decisions need to be made by consensus so that we don't have any type of action that is not expected. I believe that leading by example is essential. I remember Mandela's movie where we have the whites and blacks in this conflict, and Mandela calls the rugby captain and asks him, "How you lead?" And the captain says that he leads by example. Mandela says, exactly, perfect. So that is the example of unity, and I believe that these 11 countries are setting the example and planting the seed of progress, and I believe that that could bring a lot of fruits and that other countries can join this initiative. That's what basically, I'd like to conclude with the recognition of the Minister, Natalia Meza, Cristóbal Pineda, and all the colleagues at GIZ, and all the other organizations that contributed throughout this process and this period, so that this declaration could be come to see the light of day. And also thanking the interpreters that have participated in today's meeting. So if you could open your microphone and we could see everybody applauding. So thank you. Thank you so much. Thank you, Minister. And thank you, everyone, and all this positive energy and this excitement. I'm at this office at a subway station. I had to give an interview here, but it was a good context. And thank you so much. Thank you so much, everyone. Thank you, Minister. Please don't leave yet, everyone, because we will have a presentation by Maruxa Cardama on the progress of the transportation sector at COP30. Maruxa is secretary at the foundation. Thank you so much, Maruxa, for your participation in this webinar, and you have the floor.
Thanks very much indeed for inviting SLOCAT to this webinar. It's extremely
Thank you so much, everyone, also for the invitation.
I think that is
and SLOCAT.
Is that when we look at the trajectory of engagement of the transport community over the years in the COP processes, what has been accomplished under the leadership of Chile, it's certainly one of the peaks of engagement, if not the peak of engagement. I could invite you to jointly take a look at what has been happening over the past years and to remember that when we look at the engagement of the transport community in the COP processes, it is important to both look at what comes out of the formal negotiation track amongst countries and also what comes out of the space of voluntary commitments and initiatives. The Chilean declaration is an example of that. If we look back at the very beginnings, and I think it's worth looking at them for just a few moments, it's important to note that it all started with a rather side presence. There was in COP12 in Nairobi back in 2006, there was one side event at COP dedicated to transport. A few years later, in COP Barso in 2013, SLOCAT organized with other organizations a transport focus event, but it was outside of the COP venue. Then we get to COP Lima in 2014, and of course to COP21 Paris in 2015, and we start seeing an increased understanding that climate action needs to bring to the effort the economy-wide sectors. And this is where the conversations about involving specific thematic sectors start, and when the conversations about a just transition also start. Two elements that are, of course, essential to the engagement of the transport community over the years. And it is important as well to remember that it was in 2016 at COP in Marrakech when this idea of working directly with a thematic case sectors was institutionalized in COP processes, and this gave the birth of the Marrakech Partnership for Global Climate Action, with transport being one of the recognized sectors, and SLOCAT had the honor of being appointed as a focal point for facilitating that engagement. 2 years later, the International Transport Forum was appointed to be the co-focal point. We could see, therefore, that these efforts in 2016 translated a couple of years later into an increased thematic focus of transport at COPs, both formally and in the voluntary spaces. For instance, at COP24 Katowice in 2018, the Polish presidency launched the Katowice Partnership for Electromobility, which actually gathered a significant number in the thousands of actors committed to push forward electrification. In COP25 in 2019, the Chilean presidency made it a clear legacy of their presidency, the connection between the official track of negotiations and the sectoral transformation of different economy sectors, and convened the first, let's say, official transport day inside a COP, jointly with us. They hosted it in their pavilion. With this, we get to 2021, to what was COP26 in Glasgow, and there was a lot of emphasis on transport electrification, led directly by the UK presidency and the high-level climate champions. Thanks to the UK presidency and both Nigel Topping and Gonzalo Muñoz, the outcomes of COP Glasgow translated into the Zero Emissions Vehicle Alliance and the Breakthrough Agenda. And COP26 also saw the first state gathering of transport ministers at COP, jointly organized by the UK and the International Transport Forum. And that COP was an important one because since COP26, we have seen clearly a surge of voluntary multi-actor initiatives on transport, on land, maritime and shipping, many of which over the past years have seen an increased number of signatories and have been annually reporting the activity they have been achieving. For instance, at COP27, the Egyptian presidency of COP Sharm el-Sheikh also put forward another initiative called Lotus, Low Carbon Transport for Urban Sustainability. And in parallel, of course, we saw an increase of the transport dimension in the NDCs from the first generation to the second generation of NDCs. But more recently, I think there was another peak in the engagement of the transport community at COPs, and that was with COP28 Dubai in 2023. In the run-up to that COP, a group of organizations led by SLOCAT, REN21, IDRI, ITDP, UIC, UITP, and WRI, and over 60 stakeholders, including Chile, once again leading, and Colombia, put together a call for action asking for doubling the share of fossil-free and energy-efficient forms of land transport. And the outcomes of the first global stocktake of the Paris Agreement that were agreed at COP28 in 2023 went in that direction. We saw countries agreeing on the importance of reducing road transport emissions through a range of pathways, including electrification and other elements, and also an agreement on the need to transition away from fossil fuels, while the global community was pledging to triple global renewables capacity and double the energy efficiency ratio. Interestingly, though, what COP28 Dubai was very important because of these clear elements connected to transport, it was still blind somehow to transport when it comes to the energy announcements. It was therefore not connecting to the sectors that are the highest consumers of energy, as Daniel was saying at the very initial minutes of this webinar. And then we get to COP29 Baku in 2024, and we see a realization of the need to widen the conversation from electrification strategies to also avoid and shift strategies. And the high-level champions for climate action come up with the avoid and shift breakthrough based on the multi-actor call to action that had been launched the previous year. And here we are, 2025, in the run-up to COP30, Belém, now behind us. And I think it is important to underscore an element that was also emphasized by Daniel, the point to which COP30 is showing us that multilateralism is under tension. I would add that the rule of decision by consensus at COP is getting tougher and tougher in terms of moving the needle towards the direction needed. But we also see the increased importance that the space for voluntary commitments for implementation is gaining. And this is a space that the transport community knows well, as I've tried to illustrate by showing you how since 2006 we have this tradition as a transport community. There's 4 particular aspects that I would like to focus on when it comes to COP30, and I'm going to go relatively fast on these ones because they have already been mentioned in different ways. An important element for me is how, after decades of somehow disregarding it, we see an increased attention to adaptation and resilience. The agreement of tripling adaptation finance, particularly for low and middle income countries, and the agreement of indicators to implement a global goal for adaptation are extremely relevant to transport. As relevant as the fact that the annual losses on transport infrastructure are around 15 to 22 billion US dollars, and they hit low and middle income countries the worst. And we do know that the projections of the risk of loss of transport infrastructure by mid-century are alarming. We could be losing 98% of transport infrastructure in the current policy scenario. So it was also rather inspiring to see this increased attention at COP30. And I think it is a signal, an incentive for the transport community to continue enhancing our attention to adaptation matters with the same level of effort and interest we have been putting on decarbonization matters around COPs over the past years. A second point around COP30 for me is that increased transport dimension in the 3rd generation of NDCs that our colleagues Belén and Nikola are going to be deep diving into the next 10 minutes. And clearly we can see that we can take this increased dimension of transport forward through the voluntary mechanisms for enhancing political ambition that Daniel referred to, and also through the plans for accelerating solutions under the action agenda that was launched by the Brazilian presidency. It is important to note that there are several plans related to road, maritime, and aviation transport, both on decarbonization and on adaptation. A third element for me that, of course, is central to the webinar today and to the results of COP30 is that there is a clearer understanding of the central role of transport in, of course, reducing emissions, but also getting to the objectives of energy that we are pursuing. And thanks to the Chilean leadership around the global transport effort, we have now a clear understanding of how that could be achieved and what is the metric to get there. But I think it's important to put this global effort in the wider perspective of what was discussed at COP. 80 countries stood really firm on the importance of transitioning away from fossil fuels. And thanks to that firm stand, we saw at the last minute the inclusion in the COP agreement of this roadmap for transitioning away from fossil fuels and a just transition mechanism. These are essential elements that can actually help the transport community articulate its engagement going forward. And last but not least, my number 4, Daniel also alluded to it, is this first ever pavilion dedicated to transport in the space of COP that is restricted to accredited delegates, what is called the Blue Zone. It is important to put it into perspective. We have moved from organizing side events at the fringes of COP and in parallel venues to being at the very center of where the accredited delegates and countries are negotiating. So going forward and coming back to the point that the minister raised, we have a bit of an unprecedented connection here, an unprecedented sequence of synergies in terms of the timeline. We have the opportunity to connect the outcomes of the first global stocktake that were putting the emphasis on the need to reduce road transport emissions and transition away from fossil fuels with the Chile-led effort for transport and the United Nations Decade for Sustainable Transport. And we can do that in the horizon of 2028, which is the year in which the global community will get together again to take a second global stocktake on the implementation of the Paris Agreement. So I would argue that thanks to where we have come together with the engagement of the past decade and more, and thanks to the unprecedented momentum gained with the global transport effort led by Chile, we have now the opportunity of collectively rallying forces to get towards an agreement for a global goal for transport at the second global stocktake of the Paris Agreement in 2028. And that could be extremely momentous if we put it in the wider framework of the United Nations Decade for Sustainable Transport. It's a decade that will run until 2035. And therefore, the potential adoption of a global goal for transport in the early years of this United Nations Decade will generate further political ambition and further implementation traction over the entire decade. So a lot to celebrate, I think, in terms of the engagement of the transport community. Still a lot to get to, as Daniel was saying, the gap in terms of implementation and the gap in terms of political ambition and on both decarbonization and adaptation is huge. But certainly a series of clear pointers for us as a transport community to keep building upon and be pioneering as we were many, many years ago when we started the engagement. So back to you, Julio. Many thanks.
Thanks a lot, Maruxa, for your presentation, for actually giving us the historical perspective of the COP, the before, during, and after what's coming in future years, and also for demonstrating that despite all the problems, hurdles, being able to reach an agreement, we have advances, there are seeds being planted. So thanks very much, Maruxa. And quite related to COP this year, also countries presented and continue to present their climate commitments. And my colleague, Ellen Vasquez, and a specialist in databases, and Nikola Medimorec, Director for Data Analysis and the Investigation, prepared a presentation with an analysis regarding the increase in the ambition we see in the transport sector and what's going to happen when we compare them to what we had before. So, Belén and Nikola, the floor is yours so that you can start your presentation. Thank you.
Gracias, Julio. Thank you, Julio, for
Thanks,
the introduction.
Julio.
Yes, I'm going to start directly sharing the screen. And yeah, go right in. We would like to reach this last part of the webinar, trying to explain what has happened in this process of submitting the NDCs, or the country submitting the NDCs. I'm part of the GIZ, as you said, and I work behind the NDC Transport Tracker. It's a joint initiative by GIZ and SLOCAT. Here is representative of SLOCAT, of course, Nikola, and also Maruxa with her previous intervention. So let me share what has happened in this third generation NDCs when we look at them exactly through a transport lens. So let's go right in. So we looked at the countries and what the countries are prioritizing. What are they exactly prioritizing when they mention transport in the newest NDCs? Are they setting targets? And what type of targets? Which regions are leading in submissions? What are exactly the actions in the globe that are being prioritized? And also importantly, what's the behavior of the world biggest emitters in transport? And what are they saying in their NDCs? So these insights for us are important, and we would like to show you the global picture of it. Let's start with that. So with deadline of today, 27th of November, we have reached the 100 NDCs, third generation NDCs mark. And this means that we have more than half of the countries already with a specific third NDC submission to the UNFCCC repository. So we have this policy document. And this already gave us early signals for global trends, and this is what we want to share with you. So high-income countries and Europe are the closest to full submissions, as you can see in the graph, in the distribution by regions. And there, the other regions, for example, Africa and Latin America, Asia, still keeping up. Around half of them are reaching their expected, from the expected total. So it's worth noting also that the official deadline was February this year, early this year. And still we saw two clear waves of submissions, one in September this year and the second one right before COP. So in a way, we see this trend of needing an NDC as an entry ticket for COP to entry to this negotiation. So an NDC is really a document that remarks the ambition of the countries in all of their sectors. So with this landscape in mind, the question becomes, what these NDCs actually say about transport? And for that, we have two aspects. We go for targets, that's the main one, the first big one. And in the timeline, we can say clearly that ambition is growing. As the previous speaker said before, the NDCs are more detailed, they're more explicit about transport. So this transport is increasing its language in the NDCs, 27% more than in the first generation of NDCs back in 2015, 8% more versus the second generation of NDCs. Still, half of them have a specific transport-related target. We see two groups of targets, two groups specific related to transportation. The first one is this group of targets that aim to reduce transport emission using a quantified value with a time frame, either an absolute level, a base year reduction, a business as usual scenario reduction. These are really measurable, traceable, trackable over time. As you can see there, it's the 20%, 27% of targets. And then it's the other group that includes targets focusing more on transport areas that support the pathway towards the emission reduction. For example, here the biggest share is on the zero emission vehicles. This is the thematic area that this other type of transport targets that are popular or that are proposed in the nationally determined contributions. Another line maybe to talk about is that most of the targets also remain conditional. Now they are explicitly saying that they need or rely on international support. We can also go a little bit more to what are these high transport emissions countries. And where we look at it, it's really, looking at a mixed picture, right? Because we have the 10 top emitters that have submitted an NDC. The yellow ones do not have any transport target at all. And this is, of course, an alert, critical, because these high-emitting countries determine most of the global outcome. So if they do not commit to reducing transport emissions, we simply will not be able to close the gap. We also have 2 examples there from countries where transport is the first or one of the first sources of transport emissions, and they are specifically defining transport targets and traceable targets and measurable targets. This is a case, for example, from Thailand or Chile. I want to share also this snapshot of the world. Yellow, it's no target at all, no transport target at all. And you see a lot of yellow in the map. And this is essentially an alert for action. I would say in really simple terms, having the big emitters on board, it's not optional. It's really essential. Transport must be explicitly addressed if we want to keep with the global trajectory aligned with the Paris Agreement and also the 1.5 pathway. I think this message will be repeated by all of us for the foreseeable future. In the next part, I will also bring you, Nikola, to explain us a little bit on the specific actions that countries are stating in their NDCs.
Yes, thank you, Belén. So like as Belén said, like the first part is targets, and now we're moving to the second part where we look at actions. And again, actions are divided between actions to mitigate emissions from transport and actions to adapt the transport systems to the effects of climate change. Here, now first focusing on the mitigation actions, we can see that the third generation NDCs show that electrification and mode shift and demand management are the most popular categories. They're both head-to-head, as you can see in the figure, and they represent around a quarter of all actions related to mitigation in the transport sector. Compared to the past, electrification was like growing in popularity, but actually it's now for the first time that really dominates among the categories, and it's like kind of now the most popular category. And here also in the figure you can see that kind of aviation maritime represents a very small number of actions, or like the lowest, the smallest category. However, many of these actions in around aviation and shipping come actually from small island development states. So it also shows that kind of countries really put a lot of effort to tailor actions towards their needs, and even though it's a smaller category, they're really kind of being implemented where the impact is the biggest. Then the last part here, around half of the actions do not really point explicitly to passenger or freight transport. However, the ones, like the one in the NDC actions that really point towards transport activity, they really focus on passenger activity, passenger transport, and then just 16% focus on freight transport. The remaining are kind of a combination of both passenger and freight transport. Next slide, please. And now, in terms of transport adaptation and resilience, over 60% of third generation NDCs feature content related to this topic. It's a steady and very significant improvement throughout each generation of NDCs, as you can see in the figure. Even adaptation improves much better than kind of what we see in mitigation, where already kind of mitigation was already very, very well represented since the second generation of NDC. It's really great to see that we already have 16 NDCs with transport adaptation targets, which is already like twice as much as we had in the whole second generation of NDCs. The same goes for adaptation-related actions. Here, already now, we have more transport adaptation and resilience actions than we had in the second generation NDCs overall. But still, a major shortcoming here is that the very large majority of transport adaptation actions is very superficial. They don't really specify a transport mode, or neither do they specify a transport activity like a passenger and freight transport. Then next slide, please. Here now, just to conclude from my side, I summarized the key shortcomings. As you see, we hit the 100 NDC mark, which is means that we are at around 60% or a little bit more of NDCs have been submitted. So, but still, there's a long way to go until we really have a complete picture, until we really have all NDCs submitted. Many low-income countries still have to submit an NDC, and many of the Austrian NDCs come from countries with a very significant share of transport, with share of emissions come from transport. And as the minister has previously referred a lot to the voice shift improve framework for a balanced, comprehensive approach in transport implementation, we can also see here that many NDCs lean towards the improve side of things, so towards electrification and towards vehicle improvement. So also does not really reflect the call of the global stock take, as Maruxa has mentioned, where we want to work towards a range of pathways. And just looking at electrification is not the whole range of pathways that we have at hand and that we can implement. And then also, as mentioned, adaptation improved, but it misses still the level of detail and kind of the concreteness to really effectively guide transformation in the sector. This figure here on the right shows you an analysis of the UNFCCC on the emission projections and the impact of the new latest NDCs. It shows very good positive impact compared to before Paris and after and since the Paris Agreement, and also it shows the new NDCs lead to a reduction of 12%. However, also what the figure does not show, or actually can't even fit into this frame, is that the current ambition is not sufficient and still more needs to be done. Actually, really to be on a Paris-aligned path and to keep to achieve a 1.5 degrees Celsius global warming, we need to move towards at least 25 gigatons somewhere in the range of 20 to 27, and this would be kind of this green dot you can see at the very lower bottom of this figure. So a huge further efforts need to be put towards really put us on the right path and to move towards a decarbonization. Thanks a lot.
Muchas gracias, Nikola. Muchas gracias, Belén, por esta presentación que
Thank you so much for your presentation. We reached
recién salida del horno, ¿no? Recién desarrollada. Así que es un privilegio poder
to see the recently developed NDCs. It's great to see and observe the trends and the data that are coming up.
Just let me show the NDC tracker so that colleagues here could also access this data and do their own analysis, play with the data to have a little bit more of information in it. So as I told before, the tracker was developed jointly by GIZ and SLOCAT. This is an open global database that helps understand how countries are integrating transport in their climate commitments. So the idea is really simple: provide structured insights in a really comprehensive data set so that policymaking, research, and advocacy also can be evidence-based and also actionable. So as we said, we have a really big, comprehensive and long and big data set with more than 500 climate strategies. We have around 400 NDCs across all generations since 2015, each and every country NDCs. Also, we have the long-term strategies, around 90 so far. And we recently introduced AI assistants as well to help analysts navigate these really extensive, sometimes NDC documents, really comprehensive, really with a lot of history, a lot of proposals, and to quickly locate transport-related content. When I talked about these two waves, it was a lot of NDCs coming, and of course, to be able to bring this analysis and these insights, AI is one of our tools. And of course, if you are interested, you can find a full explanation on the tracker website, how we are using AI and how it's the whole process on how we do this analysis to be able to give you these numbers. The tool is fully open. It's really easy to explore. You can access it through our landing page. I will share it in the chat. You can navigate by country, by topic. And for those, of course, that prefer the really detailed analysis and to bring on the table their own analysis, the full data set is also available in an Excel file. Open source, no cost barriers or whatsoever, but rather impulsing this or promoting this open principle so that we can build knowledge. And finally, the dashboards, where you can interact with the data and explore dynamically. You can filter by yourself, for example, how transport actions are distributed globally in the map. You see there a quick example on how you can interact with the website and with the tracker itself. Yeah, with that I can conclude. Yeah, the NDC tracker really is designed to support your work, but again, data is just data if it doesn't give a practical use and if it doesn't support a data-driven decision making. So yeah, feel free to reach out. Really invited, cordialmente invitados, to explore the analysis, the tracker, and explore your own even insights and key understandings of where is transport located in the new NDCs. Thank you for your attention. Now, please, Julio, I give the floor to you again.
Muchas gracias, Belén. Muchas gracias por tu presentación.
Thank you so much for your presentation, Belén. I'd like to invite everyone to check out the tracker, visit the Changing Transport website. You're all invited to participate in our community for Euroclimate and transportation, Euroclimate. And Natalia, please, if you could share my email in the chat so that everyone, whoever's interested, can join the community, the practical community. We have a lot of information exchange and experiences. And with that, we conclude our webinar with that had so much information and so many people participating. We saw the results of COP30 from Daniel, and on the other end of the spectrum, and Maruxa brought us a historical context of all previous COPs and present COPs. After that, we also had the interview with our ministers to see the declaration and the seeds that are being sowed and put forward and what the goals are, especially how the process to articulate all the players to have the support that we needed. And lastly, we saw the updates on ADCs. It was a key year. We received the updated NDCs, and as we saw, we had a first-hand analysis with these 100 countries that show a trend for greater ambitions. So I hope that you enjoyed the webinar and this space to see the glass half full regarding climate change. And with that, we conclude. And thank you for the participation of everyone, and thank our interpreters for this activity today. And thank you to all our colleagues that prepared this event, our colleagues at Euroclimate, GIZ, SLOCAT, and other organizations. Thank you so much, and until next time.
Ministro, muy buenos días.
Buen
Muy
día,
buenas
Julio.
tardes por acá.